Hello, and welcome to the Black Minds Matter breakout session. I'm Kathy Kupsky, Communications and Events Coordinator here at the Crane Center. I'll be monitoring our chat box today and keeping you informed of any housekeeping items there. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the chat box. We will not be using the Q&A feature for this session, but you can submit the questions directly in the chat box, and Dr. Wood will answer them as he goes throughout the session. We're looking forward to having an honest and engaging discussion today about how we as educators and advocates for our youngest children can actively affirm Black children, and specifically how we can help promote the success of Black boys. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Luke Wood here today. Dr. Wood is the Vice President of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity and a Dean's Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. His research focuses on the factors that affect the educational success of boys and men of color in both early childhood and community college settings. He looks specifically at what contributors lead to positive outcomes. So he looks at things such as social, psychological, academic, environmental, and institutional factors. Dr. Wood is very well known. He's sought out by nationally known media as a scholar and a presenter, and has even spoken on a panel hosted by the White House. However, one of his most glowing recommendations came to us by our very own Dr. Donna Ford of OSU's College of Education and Human Ecology. It's going to be a great session. And with that, I'll turn it over. Dr. Wood, welcome.
Thank you. And again, I truly appreciate the invitation to be here and to share some of the work that we've been doing around Black Minds Matter. So with this, as long as everyone can hear me and see me, I'm going to go ahead and share screen and jump right in. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to come here and speak about the work that we've been doing focused on Black Minds Matter, which is a topic that goes far beyond me and the work that I do, and is really a collection of researchers who are really dedicated to uplifting. There's no sound. Okay, just 1 second. You can hear me? Okay, you have sound now. All right. Sorry, I saw that and wanted to stop for a moment to make sure we're still good. So, but Black Minds Matter is really a collection of researchers who are doing work focused on Black students in education. Myself, Dr. Donna Ford, who helped make the connection for today and is a collaborator and the co-host of Black Minds Matter with myself, James Moore III, who is obviously also at Ohio State University, and then a number of other scholars from throughout the country who are really engaged in doing this work. And so today I'm going to talk about what that looks like, and then we will jump in from there. So I wanted to begin by just highlighting a couple books that I have in this area. The one on the right, Black Minds Matter, was written after the first Black Minds Matter series. And what that series did is it began in 2017. And in 2017, there was a man who was unfortunately killed by police officers in San Diego, California, named Alfred Alongo. And Alfred was a refugee from Uganda. His family had escaped the regime there and had come to the United States, really looking for a new opportunity. And he had a friend who had passed away a few days before an incident took place with him. And Alfred was distraught. He didn't know what to do. He felt like he was out of sorts. And his sister, being a mental health professional, noticed that there was something just not right with him. Like there was something that was not the same. Alfred was not being himself. And so she called the police and asked for the psychiatric response team unit to come. And they did not send a psychiatric response team unit, but rather regular police officers were sent out to go meet Alfred. And they mistook something in his hand, a little bit about this size, which was a vape machine. And at very close range, Alfred was shot and was killed, unfortunately. And it was, of course, very a very difficult event in San Diego, and like many of the other issues that we've seen with, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, so many others. Ultimately, there was marches and protests, and one of the things that came out of this was there was a number of students from our university at San Diego State University that were involved in this direct action. And many of them were students who were in our PhD program in education. And we began having a number of conversations afterwards about how between the parallels that we see in policing and how we see same kinds of challenges in schooling. And so in particular, what we really honed in on is how Black lives are undervalued and over-criminalized when it comes to policing, but that we still see some of those same patterns in education where Black minds can be undervalued and over-criminalized. And there's a whole host of ways in which we see that take place in terms of undervaluing. We see the assumptions that students are academically inferior. We see lack of placement in gifted and talented education and overplacement in special education. In terms of over-criminalizing, we see excessive referrals, suspensions, and even expulsions and other forms of exclusionary discipline that really create a very differential experience. And so the work that we've been doing collectively as a group of scholars is showing the parallels between policing and schooling, with the understanding that Black lives and Black minds are intertwined. If one does not value the life, then they certainly will not value the mind. And this work, in terms of my own entree into it, really falls into two very different conversations. One is the work that I've done for many years, focused on Black students and Black males in particular in community colleges. And then the work over the past 5 years that I've done in collaboration with my colleague Adara Estian, that's really focused on Black students, particularly Black boys, in early childhood education and looking at how those patterns manifest in early learning. And so that's what we're going to be doing in terms of our conversation today. So in terms of the Black Minds Matter course, the very first time we offered the class, we brought together scholars from across the country, Sean Harper, Tyrone Howard, Ebony Zamani Gallagher, Donna Ford, just amazing scholars who do work looking at Black students in education and trying to understand what are the challenges that they face and what are things that educators can do about it. And it was a public course that we did as an open public course that anybody could take. And then we had about 10,000 people who participated in the first class, which ran for a full semester. And that class had a number of different guest speakers who are also interested in this concept and topic, but from more of a activist standpoint. So we had Patrice Cullors, who was the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Esley Merritt, who is one of the main attorneys, him and Crump really nationally focused on these issues. And we also had Ilyasa Shabazz, who's the daughter of Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz, and so many others. But what we wanted to do in this third iteration of Black Minds Matter, which just finished up in August, again, that was co-hosted with Donna Ford, was to also, in addition to scholars, was to bring in families of the fallen. And in particular, we highlighted several families that have experienced challenges with police. And in particular, we featured Michael Brown Sr., who is the father of Michael Brown Jr., Shante Needham, who's the sister of Sandra Bland. We had originally scheduled Pamela Bingay, who's the mother to Alfred Alongo, but there was a family crisis. And so we featured instead Thelma and Natasha Pinnell, who is the mother and sister of Philip Pinnell, who was one of the early cases, much long before much of this movement had even really began, given the time frame. And then also Gwen Carr, who is the mother of Eric Garner, or is the mother of Eric Garner, to bring these individuals together to talk about the lives of those who've been lost, but also to help us in drawing the parallels in terms of what they see. And it was, the whole class was very well attended. We had about 30,000 people who participated in the first session. And we see this as a movement in education. There's a lot of people who are doing work around Black minds, and we want to continue to elevate that work. But we come to this work at a very central moment in our time. We are, as a nation, facing two pandemics. First, the pandemic of COVID-19, which has disproportionately impacted minoritized communities in terms of infections, deaths, and of course, the other impacts, the downstream impacts of COVID-19 being the influence that has had on unemployment as well as unemployment. In particular, what we've seen is that minoritized communities have been adversely impacted by COVID-19. And and that creates a lot of challenge that we have to think about as we move forward into this new semester, this new quarter, depending upon the institutions that individuals are at, that really forces us to think about how communities that have been disadvantaged by our society purposely are further minoritized by COVID-19. And then the second pandemic that many have talked about is the pandemic of anti-Blackness. And so for something to be a pandemic as opposed to epidemic, it can't be necessarily localized. It has to be worldwide. And anti-Blackness is a worldwide phenomenon, no matter where you go. Unfortunately, anti-Blackness is something that is evident, but of course, there's a unique strain of anti-Blackness here in the United States where we have seen officer-involved murders of Black people, police brutality, and being while Black, or driving while Black, or walking while Black, swimming while Black, sleeping in your own house while Black. And what we have to think about is this, is that the children who are in our classrooms right now have been experiencing COVID-19 and the restriction and losses that come along with that. But in addition to that, they also saw a man murdered on television, George Floyd. And that played over and over and over again for 8 weeks in the news. And then that followed by the coverage of Breonna Taylor and Jacob Blake and so many other things that have occurred, that we really have to begin to think about what are the physiological and emotional effects of these dual pandemics on our Black children. And from our perspective, in the work that we do, we believe that the urgency is now. And in fact, throughout the Black Minds Matter course, a lot of people talked about this notion that we have to really start from the beginning. People talked about a fresh restart. Gloria Ladson-Billings talked about hard reset. Everyone has talked about this notion that we cannot go back to the way that things were before. In fact, one of the things that Gloria Ladson-Billings said in the program, in the course, is that a lot of people are talking about that we just need to get back to normal, right? Being in person, engaging people the ways that we used to, as if nothing ever happened. But she also said that normal is where the problem was. That is where the challenges had manifested for Black communities. And so getting back to normal only means getting back to the way that things have been done before. And what we have right now is a unique moment to do something different than has ever been done before. But we also have to do that in recognition of the history, that these issues did not start with Breonna Taylor. They did not start with Jacob Blake. They did not start with George Floyd. They started long before them in the history of our nation, beginning with the Middle Passage and with slavery, and how Black peoples and Black communities have been engaged and treated by society since the very beginning. So getting back to normal doesn't resonate with many people who come from communities that have been downtrodden, because what you see on your screen is what normal has been in the United States. And as a person who is a critical race theorist, you know, obviously I'm attentive to the fact that laws and policies over time have been used against people of color, and that includes education policies, laws, and structures to only further reify the position of those who are in power and to subjugate those who are in positions where they have less power. And so we have to think about this in terms of the lives that have been lost, or those who have had incredibly difficult circumstances that they've faced, and recognizing that this movement around Black lives and Black minds impacts Black people of all backgrounds. On this slide here, you see those who identify as men, those who identify as women, those who identify as transgender, across all communities. And then if we think about the deaths of COVID-19, you can see here on the slide, this is data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This is from their COVID-19 data tracker. And you can see that there is a disproportionate impact for communities impacted by COVID-19. And really, when we're looking at ages really 5 through 29 years old, it's a significant overrepresentation of those who are come from Black communities, and then from 30 and above from those who come from brown communities. And ultimately, what we recognize is that there is an adverse impact, and this has a real toll on students who are coming into the classroom. And a lot of people use the word trauma, right? And they say that students are coming into the classroom with trauma because of the George Floyd incident, because of COVID-19. And I would say, yes, that is true to an extent. But we also have to recognize that trauma happens in schools, and trauma happens in colleges, and trauma happens in universities, and the role that educators have in perpetuating and reinforcing and extending that trauma. The other issue that we become incredibly attentive to, and I know that many probably in this audience are as well, is the role that digital equity has. Recognizing that there are students who don't have access to computers and regular Wi-Fi and the things that they need to be able to be successful inside and outside of the classroom, and just even the support to be able to get that done. That there are incredibly different conditions in a different playing field that we have to recognize is taking place right now that is impacting our students. So, for example, some of the challenges that we see across Black students, regardless of whether they're in early childhood education or whether they are in post-secondary education, are issues around basic needs. We have students who struggle with food insecurity and housing insecurity, where they don't know where they're going to lay their head at night or where their next meal will come from. Obviously, your ability to be attentive to and focus in the classroom is impacted by the availability of food. And I've definitely seen that there are a number of schools right now that are making food available and lunches available to students, but that doesn't mean that could also mean, though, that that's the only meal that they're having that day. And so we need to keep that in mind. We also have to keep in mind the access to school and campus resources. Students right now, their main engagement in an online environment is virtual. It's through Zoom, it's through Skype, it's through whatever platform people are using, it's through a learning management system, it's through a website, it's through emails, right? It's not the in-person interaction. And so there's a lot that can be lost in translation. Now, the interesting thing about this is there's a number of parents that I've had conversations with as of late that have talked about this in two different ways. One is the benefit of this, right? Which is I hear so many parents right now talking about how their children are regaining a sense of confidence, how they're feeling more self-assured, how they're being built up in ways because they're not in classrooms to be torn down. But there's also an incredible loss of academic learning that's taking place right now. I mean, if we think about it, there's a number of families that have created pods, and we're seeing the emergence of pods across the country where people are coming together, they're working with a teacher, they're hiring a teacher for those who come from affluent communities, and they're getting reinforcement in person to what is taking place online. And of course, we think about the communities who have access to that. Those are communities who regularly have resources that are available to them that are oftentimes not available to our Black students. We also have to think about students at home. I have 3 children, 2 of them who are in early education right now, at home right now on the same internet that I am, right? Trying to work in the same space. And even during, right as this presentation began, I got the deadly, your internet is unstable. Why? Because people are on the internet. And so the challenges of balancing demands of home and school and people working in the same areas and parents trying to work online or be essential employees and work in person. And so all of this to say is that there's a lot of pressure right now that has never been felt before by our students. And if we're not doing more than we're doing right now, then we're really not rising to the challenge that is in front of us. So with that in mind, I want to just kind of go to what some of the framing is that we hear. So I do a lot of the work that I do focused on suspensions, expulsions, and exclusionary discipline in all forms, really focused on students and early learning. And it is almost invariable that when I talk to principals and school teachers, that oftentimes, or school heads, oftentimes when there are breakdowns in performance, that students are being over-referred to the office, or they're being, they're the students who are most likely to be sitting in timeout, or to have restrictions of recess or other types of important activities. When there are breakdowns, the usual response is to say, what the heck is wrong with these students? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? Right? This deficit notion that I know many of us are familiar with, to blame students, blame families, and blame their communities. And what we want to do is to avoid jumping to the wrong assumptions. And this is what we see too often, is that when there are breakdowns, and especially the breakdowns that we're seeing in COVID-19, that we don't jump to the assumption that the student doesn't care, that they're not committed, that they're not engaged, right? These are children in early learning, right? These are parents who want to see their children do well. So if we see breakdowns in communication, such as a student's internet isn't working, or they haven't logged in on time, or they might not have completed an assignment on time, they might have turned in work late, or they didn't understand how to use that technology to turn their camera off or to turn their camera on, or they change their name, or they're not immediately responsive, or they haven't hit the button to go into the breakout room. It's to not immediately jump to conclusions that they don't care, but to ask ourselves, is there something else that could be going on? And again, in the context of the two pandemics, I think that there's a lot. And so a lot of educators right now are giving themselves a bit more grace. We need to also extend that grace to the students and families that we're working with as well. And as we become aware of these challenges, it's to approach it from a very different standpoint and to say to themselves, you know, what are we doing or not doing as a school that results in our Black students not doing as well as they should? Or if we're concerned about a student being engaged or a family member being engaged, what have we created in terms of conditions that ignore or even bar that engagement? And asking ourselves, have we communicated that a student's engagement is both desired and invited? And I also see another example given here in the chat window about, is a family embarrassed to turn on the camera at home, which is a great point, because a lot of people don't necessarily want to show what that home environment looks like, or that home environment could even be a safe space that they don't feel comfortable showing to those who they don't find to be safe themselves. And so there's a lot of things that we have to take into account. And so my perspective and that of my colleague Frank Harris, who we've written extensively on this, on what we call the pyramid of success. And oftentimes what we believe is that educators start from the top. They start out with looking at outcomes related to student success. And then when we think about what professional learning and professional development look like for most educators, whether it's in service or pre-service, it's oftentimes focused on effective and engaging practices, the how-tos of how to teach, how to engage students in either multicultural counseling techniques, culturally relevant teaching techniques, and all of those things are important, right? We need to focus on that. But if we haven't focused on the base of the pyramid, which is our perceptions, then we're never really going to get to changing the practices that we see on the ground. We believe that perceptions is the starting point. We need to be doing professional learning with educators on how they see themselves, how they see their students, and how they see their own roles as educators. And oftentimes what we find is that those perceptions are informed by stereotypes that translate into differential treatment in the classroom. And I'm going to give you some very specific examples in a moment here as to what that looks like. But then the next part is, once we have dealt with and engaged our perceptions, and think about the relationships. Relationships are a foundational precondition to any effective teaching, learning, counseling, advising, or any support practice for students. So we have to have relationships that are typified by what we say is trust. Student has to be able to trust that the educator cares about them, cares about their success. There has to be mutual respect. They have to believe that the educator is willing to engage them and doesn't see them as a nuisance, but sees them as someone who's worthy of investing their time and resources. And authentic care. Authentic care really refers to this notion that as educators, what we have to do with the students that we are working with, whether they're in early childhood education or doctoral education, is communicate an authentic care, where if they do well, we communicate that we personally feel like we have done well, right? Because there's this shared or linked vested interest. And similarly, on the flip side, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, that we are going to personally feel like we missed the mark. And so all of that goes to say is that the foundation to a pyramid of success begins with perceptions, because how I perceive someone influences how I relate to them, which ultimately influences the effective and engaging practices that I'm going to implement as a early childhood educator or educator of any really type of sort. So definitely wanted to just put those kinds of concepts out there. But as we get further into early learning, we have to recognize that there's a unique manifestation of the challenges that we see in policing and in schooling in early childhood education. And unfortunately, other than scholars such as Donna Ford, James Earl Davis, Brian Wright, who I saw is going to be on the schedule for this particular meeting, which I was very happy to see. It's a great scholar and colleague. My colleague Adar Essian. There's not a lot of people really who are doing work that's publishing scholarship that's looking at how these issues manifest in early learning, and it manifests very differently. The patterns and principles are the same, but it looks different. And so we have to recognize a number of different foundational things. One of those is that labeling occurs. And that when we're talking about Black boys, no different than when we're talking about George Floyd or Tamir Rice, that there is this notion that they are perceived in a way that is different from their peers, that they are labeled early on as aggressive, as troublemakers, as being too active, as hyperactive, as dangerous. That labeling occurs early on, and that labeling follows them throughout their educational journey. And the reason that this matters is because we know that by fourth, fifth, sixth grade, that many boys come to disassociate with school. And even more so, we know this occurs with Black boys, but not as a function of what Black boys uniquely bring to the school. They are interested in learning. They want to learn. That's why they're there, like any other student, but they are viewed differently. Both their actions and their cognitive abilities are viewed differently by educators. And this matters because early childhood education is a site for the formative development of children. And so we must think about what that means for children early on. And so this brings us to three different principles that are absolutely critical to any conversation. And that is distrust, disdain, and disregard. So distrust really deals with assumptions of criminality, where we assume that students are dangerous, deviant, up to no good. Disdain really deals with this notion of really, and all this I should say is centered in the work of Chester Pierce, and in particular Daryl Wing Su's conceptualizations of racial microaggressions and how those manifest in all sectors. And we've really done a lot of work trying to translate what that looks like in early learning. And one of those is disdain. And that really deals with two different concepts that he talks about in his work. One is pathologizing culture, where we assume that the values and communication styles of people of color, of children of color, are lesser than. And when we think about this as the they statements, that they're lazy, that they don't care, that they're not really here for school. That's pathologizing of culture and values. But disdain also refers to these ways in which Black children are treated as second-class citizens in the classroom. So it's this holistic notion of disdain. And then disregard refers to this assumptions of or ascriptions of intelligence, where we assume that children are academically inferior. And from our work, what we see is that in early learning, the D3 effect is in play: distrust, disdain, disregard. And there's a lot of scholarship that helps to support the evidence of these challenges. Then we have to think about what this looks like both in early learning and then how this manifests throughout the educational pipeline. So let's begin with distrust. And what you see here are a number of different patterns. And in fact, we just had a study that was recently published in the Journal of African American Studies. We have a parallel study in Journal of Negro Ed, Western Journal of Black Studies, and the Early Childhood Education Journal. So I'm amalgamating several different studies together here to show that. But ultimately, what we've identified are indicators of criminalizing Black children in early childhood education. And what we did is we've done a counter-narrative study with hundreds of parents now of Black children. And I say parents of Black children because they're not necessarily all Black people themselves, though the vast majority are. But you can have, of course, people who are parents of Black children who aren't necessarily Black themselves. Children could be mixed race, they can be adopted, foster care, wards of the court, raised by grandparents. So there's a number of different ways in which this can manifest. But in our qualitative work with them, what we've done is ask them to write narratives. Essentially, these are counter narratives describing the experiences of them and that of their children in early childhood education. And these are some of the patterns that have manifested around indicators of criminalizing Black students. And then we've turned this now into a quantitative study as well, where we're looking at how these patterns break out differentially across teachers and teacher backgrounds. But the first is that they assume that children who are Black are troublemakers, right? And so there's this innate assumption that if they are Black, that they must be a problem child. And so therefore, what they're going to do is to label that child, as I mentioned before, as being aggressive or hyper or misbehaving or being physical. And once that label has been added to that child, that label follows that child around from one teacher to the next teacher, regardless of the actual actions that go to either support or negate that perceived behavior. Then what happens is that educators spend more time watching that child for wrongdoing. And we have a lot of examples of this where parents talk about being in a classroom and volunteering and teachers spending time the physical gaze on Black children, looking at them for wrongdoing. Now, of course, there's been work that's looked at this quantitatively through Walter Gilliam and the work that he's done out of Yale University with the eye software that essentially tracks eye movement. And I know that many of you are aware of his work and how when presented to early childhood education educators videos of children and told to look for problematic behavior with videos of children engaging one another, that educators in his studies has spent more time looking at Black children and even more time looking at Black male children when they are prompted to look for wrongdoing because of this assumption, this labeling, and then this hyper attentiveness to Black children that takes place in the classroom. In addition, what we find is that, and this is probably overwhelmingly the largest pattern, is reports of children being singled out for punishment, even when they're engaging in the same behaviors as other children. So, for example, you have four boys. They're in kindergarten and they're in the playground and they're throwing rocks. And should they be throwing rocks? Absolutely not. Is it probably developmentally appropriate that they would do so and that would be something that they would need correction on? Absolutely. But is their actions viewed in the same way? And the answer is no. What happens is that educators view their actions differently than they do others, and therefore they're singled out. So you have these four boys that are throwing rocks, but the one boy who is called out for doing so, who might have to sit in timeout, who has a restriction from recess, is the Black boy amongst his peers. And we see this as a recurrent pattern. Then it's not only being assumed to be wrong and then labeled as wrong, spending more time and then being singled out, but there's a punishment that comes with that. And what we find is that the punishments are harsher and they're more prolonged. So for one child who gets a suspension, another child gets an expulsion, another child gets a referral, another child gets a suspension, another child gets a restriction from recess, another child has something else. So there's a differential application of discipline in early childhood education. I see a comment here says this also stems from child's home environment, what he's being told, what he sees, and how it unfolds in the classroom. So certainly home environments shape how educators perceive children. And an example of that is what we've seen in the news, where there has been several instances, high profile instances of Black boys in particular who've been suspended or reprimanded for having play toys in the background that could be emblematic of weaponry. But of course, how they are engaged and how other children are engaged is oftentimes very different. Then what we find is that there can be a disciplined immediately. So there's another set of patterns that we see. They can be disciplined immediately when there's a perceived wrongdoing, and that oftentimes that they are assumed to be the cause of the problem. This is what we refer to as a concept called reverse causality. And we see this as a regular pattern. In fact, we have a paper that we're working on that focuses just on this because we've had so many different narratives around this experience, where a child goes up to a teacher, a Black child, to talk about something that has been done to them that's wrong, right? And as an example, a child pushed them, so they go up to the teacher and they let the teacher know that this child has pushed me. And the response from the teacher isn't to say, I'm sorry that this happened, or to console them, or to want to go and intercede with the other child. It's to say to them, well, what have you done to cause this to occur? It's this reverse causality where it's assumed that, going back to that very first point, that they are the locus of the problem, and therefore it must be them that caused this to occur. And as a result, we see, because of this kind of pattern, that they're oftentimes mistaken as being the ones who've done wrong. And of course, we see, as part of criminalizing, and as part of what we see in terms of assuming that they're less intelligent, that there are behavioral disorders and cognitive disorders that are assumed to be underlying, which is why we see, again, such an overrepresentation among those who are identified as having learning disabilities, and an overrepresentation of those who are identified as being emotionally and behaviorally disturbed, even in the earliest levels of education. So what are some examples of this? I want to provide some quotes from the parents. One parent said, "I volunteered in my preschool classroom. The teacher approached me and tells me, 'You need to watch out for Jamal. He held the scissors the other day and started swinging it at the other students. The teacher made it seem that Jamal was a villain or a criminal for pretending to use the scissors incorrectly.' While she was saying, 'Watch out,' Johnny, a white boy in the class, held the same scissors and did the same thing. The teacher then said in a nice tone, 'Johnny, is that the right thing to do?' and then carried on with the lesson." So this parent was noticing this very differential engagement and treatment of actions that were perceived as being similar. Another example: "My son's first grade teacher would call home for every little infraction. Some of the punishments were often severe, even for a small thing, and didn't match the quote unquote crime, such as turning around in his seat one time would result in the whole day being marked as bad. Some of the behavior issues that were written about would happen one time, and the teacher would prolong the punishment instead of dealing with it and moving on." Another example of this is in these quotes here. In first grade, my son was regularly sent home with notes regarding minor infractions. When I would question him, he mentioned how 3 or 4 other boys, later discovered that they are white, were also doing the same things, and they didn't get into trouble. Another example, and this is a perfect example being singled out. An incident happened where a Caucasian boy pointed out a rainbow, and about 3 other kids looked at it. I remember the main administrator specifically naming and shaming our son. "Our son is quiet and tends to follow the crowd. He can get mouthy when questioned, but what kid doesn't when he's singled out when 4 other kids seem to get a pass? It doesn't help the situation, but I can't blame him. That seems unfair." And so these are examples of differential treatment in early learning. But what I also wanted to do was show you how these similar patterns also manifest in other levels of education. So here are just a couple examples from post-secondary education with Black students. So this is from and these are all from the COVID era, so they're all from online classes. And this first one is a discussion board post where a student says to another student, "I'm sorry, and I'm not trying to be racist, but people of color come from neighborhoods with lots of crime. It's a fact. Just watch the news." Or an email response from a faculty member: "I wrote the professor to let him know I wasn't able to attend class because my internet was down. He wrote back very condescendingly, insinuating that I was lying." And the student was like, "Lots of people are having internet problems right now." So it was a sense of feeling treated differently. And then the last example here I have on this is, "I asked my professor for an extension on the assignment during virtual office hours, which I was attending on my phone because my computer isn't working. She was like, 'How come you didn't tell me earlier that you were having computer issues? If you would have, I would have been able to grant the request.' It was clear that she didn't believe me." And so again, I wanted to show how these patterns go across all levels of education. But again, let's look at that now, the second type of mistreatment. And this is that notion of second-class citizenship or pathologizing culture, which we were collectively referred to as disdain, how Black children are treated with disdain. So, for example, we find in our work in early learning with these hundreds of narratives that we have from parents, is that they believe that your children have been talked down to. We find numerous examples of Black children being restricted access to the bathroom in comparison to other children. And in fact, one of the schools that I was working most closely with my colleague, Idara Essian, was a school where one of the impetuses for bringing us in was that there was a teacher who had had multiple children pee their pants in her classroom who are Black children, and parents were angry because it was in multiple instances, two children had asked the teacher to use the restroom. In both cases, it was a Black child and a non-Black child, and the non-Black child was permitted to go first. And so there was a lot of anger from the parents, understandably so, and they felt like it had created a demoralizing experience for their children. We find that children are treated as generally lesser than for a number of different reasons. The perception that they come from a fatherless home, or that they come from a bad neighborhood, or that they have parents who don't care or aren't engaged, or that they come from a home that's undisciplined, or that they come from a home that's lower income. And so oftentimes we find that this translates in the classroom, the children being ignored and other children's learning being prioritized over that of children of color, and in particular, Black children. Here are some examples of what that looks like in early learning that we see. And this is Disdain. And so my son's teacher yelled at my son for spilling a little paint. And mind you, it's washable paint. Other kids spilled it too, but it doesn't seem to bother them, only when the Black kids do it. And so it's just kind of example of this kind of differential treatment. Another example, my child was in second grade and his teacher was an older teacher. My child made a joke and my teacher made him cry. Now, I think we would all agree that children probably should be attentive and not making jokes in the classroom, but it's probably also developmentally appropriate for a child in second grade to be learning about what is an appropriate and inappropriate space for this to occur. And so in this quote, it goes on to say that my child made a joke and his teacher made him cry. She said, second grade is no place for jokes. She then told another teacher that he is a clown, a class clown. And then she made him stand in front of the class, including the other teacher and another associate, and they kept it up and made him cry. And then after making him cry, she also yelled at him. And this is an example of what takes place actually with a Black girl, a young Black girl. But these are examples of being treated in a way that's harsher and less warm and welcoming and loving than that of their peers. And that's why a lot of the work that I've done, I always provide this quote, and it's from Asa Hilliard, who was a scholar of multiple different disciplines. And after years of doing research on Black children, one of the things that he said was, there's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing that you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them. But we also know that love is not equally distributed. And these are examples of how that occurs. I'll read one more example here at the bottom. My son, Daryl, was a student at a school in first grade. When he asked to use a bathroom, the teacher said, wait. Sadly, the child wet his pants. Every student made a joke of it. I felt that the teacher would have been compassionate to my son. This would not have happened. And then in higher ed, we see very similar patterns. And these are all, again, examples from the COVID era. So online examples. So one is an online office hours. So I logged on to the online office hours with the professor. I asked a question. His response was, did you do the readings? The assumption was that the student was lazy, didn't care, and of course, therefore, didn't do the readings. I'll go to another example at the bottom from an instructor emails. And this is from a student who said, so apparently the professor has been reaching out to students to check in on them. He was only doing this with his favorite students. All of us Black students know that that means he's not reaching out to us anytime soon. And then the third area of this D3 effect of distrust, disdain is disregard. And that is disregard for the academic intelligence of Black students. And so as an example, we find that Black students are assumed to be unintelligent. And this goes back to lots of research that has shown this through overplacement in special education, underplacement in gifted and talented education with the incredible work that Donna Ford has done, praising other children for academic successes and not providing that same praise to Black children, avoiding rewarding them for academic successes. And we find this particularly salient around award ceremonies, putting children down in public, conveying a sense of surprise, and this is a really big one, when children succeed academically. How I like to think about this is what happens when Black children outperform low expectations. Think about that for a second. What happens when Black children outperform low expectations? Well, oftentimes the assumption is that if they do, that they must have cut corners, they must have not done it right. And so what we also find is that they're then further forced to prove their intelligence, and that way, if they do something right, they might be asked to do it right again, because we want to make sure that you actually know this, because the assumption is that they don't know. And then, of course, the whole intersection that this has with special education and overplacement in special education. So here are some examples and quotes from parents on how this plays out. Halfway through kindergarten, a new teacher was assigned to the class within the first 2 weeks of being there. She recommended all the Black children, including our daughter, to be tested for special education. She then rearranged all the desks and put them all at one desk in the back of the classroom. And so this was it from a kindergarten class where, and I believe it was 5 Black children were in this class, 5 or 6 Black children who were all put in the back of the class. Next one is my son's second grade teacher did not want to acknowledge the fact that my son was the smartest in her class. Each quarter, students were rewarded based upon their achievements on what grade students made. She made sure to give out the White Students Awards with pride and smiles on her face. She even gave each one a little speech on how great they were. Only my Black child's name was called with no excitement and just handed his award with no words. And we find that to be a very recurrent pattern. Here, and there's other examples of this. He had been doing well, but she consistently treated him like he did not. He constantly had to prove himself in ways that others didn't, even when they didn't. My teacher asked if anyone would like to read aloud. My son volunteered to do so. However, her tone showed that she didn't think he could. As soon as he stumbled, only a little bit, she immediately cut him off and asked if anyone else would like to read. Another example, at the beginning of second grade, I met with my daughter's teacher. She placed our daughter on a reading level of 15 when she had been a 20, the highest in her class last school year. I asked her to retest her. There was no way my daughter was performing that low, especially with our very productive summer. She tested her and said, "Wow, she is actually smart." Those "actually smart" words have stuck with me as a parent. It has been one of the most hurtful responses about my daughter. It was painful because there was doubt that my daughter could perform well. And so why is all this taking place? Well, ultimately, we have a society that is rooted in supremacy and racism and dehumanization since its very beginning. And that creates a differential experience in policing and in education for Black students that is really rooted in undervaluing and over-criminalizing. And you can see how Black lives and Black minds intersect in that those undervaluing and over-criminalizing produce parallel patterns between the use of deadly force and exclusionary discipline, excessive use of force and zero tolerance, racial profiling and in-school tracking. And there are direct parallels that we see between the policing of Black lives and the schooling of Black minds. But this is much larger than even this conversation can afford, because this goes into larger patterns across our society. The United States is overwhelmingly incarcerating individuals in comparison to any other country, followed only by El Salvador, Rwanda, Russia, and down from there. In addition, we find that it's not just throughout time that this has been a static pattern, but that the pattern really changed in the 1980s. And you can see this on the chart, US state and federal prison population, that it rose precipitously in the 1980s following the Get Tough on drugs, war on crime, and the views of Black people as hyper criminals, as super predators and super threats. And this has disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities, and that is Black lives. But in Black minds, we see that even in preschool, and this is data from the US Civil Rights Project, that while Black children count for 18% of preschool enrollment, that they count for 42% of out-of-school suspensions and 48% of multiple out-of-school suspensions, and that disparity rate doesn't just stop in preschool, but continues throughout the rest of K-12 education. So I know I'm getting low on time here, so I'm just going to shed a couple more pieces of information before closing. And that is that I've done a number of different studies recently with colleagues, such as particularly with Tyrone Howard and Frank Harris, and some of even our student colleagues, looking at suspension rates across our own state of California. And we have found some really and very disappointing patterns. But probably the most important pattern that we have found is this, is that while the highest suspension rates are always in middle school, that when we look at the disparities in suspensions between Black children and their peers, that the biggest disparity is not in high school, it's not even in middle school or in latter elementary, but it's in early childhood education. That is where we see the greatest disparity between Black children and their peers. And I presented a number of different patterns that serve as the foundation for leading to those disparities. And so I just want to use that as an opportunity to close and to I see that there's a few questions and comments. I know that there's a lot else that's going on with this convening. I just want to say that I truly appreciate your time, your attention to these issues. And if there's one or two questions, I can take those. Otherwise, I want to make sure we close within the next 2 minutes. All right. Well, seeing none, I just want to say, and I see the thank yous. I just want to say thank you to you, and to just say that I appreciate the work that all of you are doing on elevating Black lives and Black minds. This is a unique time that we are in. And so as we try to improve the lives and conditions of Black people in policing, let us not forget that the same patterns are taking place inside our classrooms every single day, and that it all begins in early learning. Thank you all.